This is Danghara, in southern Tajikistan. It's a quiet place. Cows chew grass near the main square. People wash their clothes on the street. Carpets are hung out to dry in the sun. There's a rock display with assorted animals. And during summer, men sell melons in the afternoon. In the last video, we looked at the civil war in Tajikistan. So the Tajik government chose this guy, Emomali Sharpovich Rahmon, to be a compromise candidate. He was just about acceptable to both sides of the civil war, the assorted warlords and Islamist groups, as well as the government establishment. In the words of one of these warlords, he was nondescript, and most of the powerful figures thought that they could sideline him once he served his purpose. Almost 30 years later, he's still in charge. This video is about Tajikistan today. This is the final of 3 videos about Tajikistan. The first looks at who the Tajiks are in the context of Central Asia. The second is about Soviet Tajikistan and the civil war that followed. This video is about Tajikistan today. If you like your context in chronological order, I suggest you check out the other 2 first. If not, I won't stand in your way. I hope you enjoy. So, let's start with the story of Emomali Rahmon. The reason I left Dushanbe one day in July and headed south. The reason I was in Danghara is because it is the birthplace of Emomali Rahmonov, current president of Tajikistan. The start to Rahmonov's life was unremarkable. He was born to a poor peasant family, trained as an electrician, worked at a cheese factory, and then did 3 years of military service in the Soviet Navy. He later became the head of the local state-owned farm, and from there, head of the district. In 1992, near the start of the conflict that we looked at in the previous video, Rahmonov was made Prime Minister of Tajikistan. It took until 1997 to reach a peace deal with the opposition, which effectively ended the civil war, and it took Rahmonov longer than that to consolidate his power, during which there was an attempted assassination and 2 coup attempts. But eventually he did. However, for a long time he was actually dependent on foreign troops to stay in power. By that I mean the Russians, who had stuck around after the end of the Soviet Union and were significant players during the Civil War. In fact, Russian troops actually guarded Tajikistan's borders all the way until 2005. The opposition were supposed to have 30% of government posts and seats in parliament, but it didn't take Rahmonov long to go back on that deal. Now he gets consistently elected to 7-year terms in just flagrantly rigged elections, and now it is very much him who is in charge of Tajikistan, with the partial exception of the Pamir region, which we will look at in the next video. Under Rahmonov, corruption is eye-watering. According to one foreign ambassador, President Rahmonov prefers to control 90% of a $10 pie, rather than 30% of a $100 pie. Rahmonov and his family control the country's major businesses, including the largest private bank. Anything of value is snapped up by the presidential family. His eldest daughter is head of the presidential administration, and her husband is deputy head of the National Bank of Tajikistan. Most of the revenue from the state-owned company that controls aluminium exports goes straight to a secretive offshore company controlled by the president. Meanwhile, his son has recently been made Speaker of Parliament, which is now the second most important role in the country, and the eligible age of the presidency has been dropped to accommodate him. And most recently, in 2020, Rahmonov was re-elected with more than 90% of the vote. He has established in Tajikistan the sort of extravagant one-man rule that unfortunately is associated with the region. The president's photo shoots are absolutely legendary, especially with agricultural produce, like here, where he looks presidential in a field of wheat, or here, distinctly unimpressed with these pomegranates, corn, apples, and peaches. Here he is in front of some nuts, and some preserves. He inspects a tree. Sometimes it's farm animals, like turkeys, deer, or pheasants. Here he has a live one, smelling her for freshness. This crop he's less impressed by. And who gave me this pomegranate? Was it you? Since 2015, he has held the lifetime title of Leader of the Nation, or in full, Founder of Peace and National Unity, Leader of the Nation. This includes lifetime immunity from prosecution, including for his relatives. Often poems are read in his honor in Parliament. State media compares him to the sun. In public, he can only be addressed as Your Excellency. And in 2017, a law was passed that decreed that all Tajik media could only refer to the president as the founder of peace and unity, leader of the nation, president of the Republic of Tajikistan, His Excellency Emomali Rahmon. News presenters complain it takes them a full 19 seconds to say each time. And, of course, in Tajikistan, you're never too far away from a picture of Emomali Rahmonov. In 2007, Rahmonov took the Russian "ov" from his name, changing from Rachmanov to Rahmon. Since then, he has aimed to encourage Tajikness. A new law has banned newborn babies being given names with Russian-style endings, which was a common practice during Soviet times. Babies have to have native-style names, and there is a list of 3,000 acceptable first names for children. This is a part of his effort to build a national identity, not just around himself, but around the idea of a Tajik nation, instead of around an Islamic identity. Supporters see Rahmon as the person who ended the civil war through compromise and negotiation, and who since then has more or less maintained stability and peace. Opponents say he is an authoritarian who has created a cult of personality and eliminated political opponents and violated human rights and freedoms while maintaining a corrupt gangster state, keeping Tajikistan one of the poorest countries in the world. Both are probably true. Having said that, if you do actually find yourself in Tajikistan, as I did on this pleasant summer's evening, it doesn't feel hopelessly unhappy. Like everywhere, people go on living their lives. In fact, I found Tajiks to be the most expressive and cheerful of the people I met in Central Asia. As you can see here, during my visit to Danghara, the president's hometown, it's quiet and really rather nice. The next morning I went for a walk around Danghara. This is Rahmon's house, by the way. When I passed it with my camera the evening before, I got stopped by the security men outside for about 10 minutes while they asked me questions. Anyway, this morning I went to the Bazaar to check it out. I found a little restaurant where I ate shashlik. So this is chai. And then I went back to the hotel to collect my things. It was a nice place actually. They were keeping chickens in the bathroom. That afternoon I continued on my journey, heading west to Qurghonteppa. I had some dinner and then retired to my room to watch some television. So, the civil war ended, Rahmon gradually took control, and it has in fact all been peaceful elections since then, although Tajikistan has never had an election that was judged to be fair by independent observers. The aftermath of the civil war has basically seen the installation of a neo-Soviet model without the communism, if that makes any sense at all. The economy is controlled by the government without much redistribution or opportunities for advancement. The regional factions on the winning side have worked their way into the government, along with their organized criminal networks. Russia still maintains a base in their country. Actually, it's their biggest base outside of Russia itself, and keep in mind that Russia and Tajikistan don't actually share a border. Tajikistan went from being a colony of Russia to something like a protectorate, although this came in handy this past summer when Afghanistan was collapsing and the Tajiks were worried about the instability creeping into Tajikistan. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Tajikistan has had difficult relations with its neighbors, especially Uzbekistan, even though it was actually Uzbekistan that essentially kept Rahmon in power during the civil war. Uzbekistan accused Tajikistan of sheltering a terrorist group that was attacking them, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan actually sent warplanes into Tajikistan without consulting the Tajik government to bomb the IMU camps in the Tajik mountains. It's unlikely that Rahmon had any sympathy for the Islamists, given he opposed them in the civil war, but at this stage in his rule he didn't have the control to risk upsetting the post-war balance. In addition to Uzbekistan, to the south in Afghanistan, the Taliban considered Rahmon's government to be an enemy, because he was, after all, anti-Islamist, and had helped their opponents in Afghanistan. Then September 11 happened, and it changed everything. Suddenly, the US needed partners in the region, as well as territory from which to conduct operations in Afghanistan, and they massively supported Rahmon's government. Soon, Washington was funding more than a third of the national budget. In return, the US military could use Tajik airfields, which were also used by international aid organizations to supply Afghanistan. Both of these employed a lot of Tajiks locally, and aid poured into the country. A short time later, the hostile Taliban regime in Afghanistan was removed. By 2007, Rahmon had more or less discarded the peace agreement and had neutralized most of his opponents. He was in charge of Tajikistan. To give you an idea about the sort of regime that Rahmon leads in Tajikistan, in 2015, the leader of an opposition movement, Umar Ali Kuvatov, who had fled the country, fell ill while having dinner in Istanbul. The Turkish media speculated that it was because of poisoning, and it actually may have been possibly Rahmon. Whether or not that was true, when he went outside for medical help, he was shot in the back of the head. It's not the only apparent assassination attempt of opposition figures outside of Tajikistan's borders. Coming forward in time, the government initially took a pretty permissive attitude to COVID-19. In March of 2020, thousands of people celebrated Navruz together. As I visited Tajikistan, officially it had no cases of COVID because the government said so. Doctors that have claimed otherwise have been jailed, which is unfortunate because in July of 2020, the president's sister died of COVID, so her sons, the president's nephews, actually beat up the health minister. The next morning I found myself down the road in Sarband, looking to go hiking, in a graveyard above a hydropower dam. A train chugged along in front of the dusty, dry hills. I enjoyed the view of the dam and then descended to the bridge, where I filled up my water bottle. A guy gave me a ride across to the other side, and then I started walking. Clinging to the hills were pistachio trees with their brightly coloured fruit. However, I had forgotten to buy a second bottle of water, and at the top I realised that my single bottle just wasn't going to cut it. It was pretty hot, around 36 degrees by that point, and there wasn't a lot of cover. So I took a track going down the hill and followed a dry creek bed back to the river. Then, at a spot a little way away from these goats, I was attacked by some dogs, which I didn't record because I was busy being attacked by dogs. However, I crossed at the railway bridge and found my way back into town. By this point, I was pretty thirsty. Here is where it got interesting, because as I was walking through town, I found this cool looking building and went inside to check it out. It turns out it was the town cultural centre, and I'm not exaggerating anything by saying that they were really excited to see me, a tourist. I think I was the first tourist in quite a long time. First, they showed me their library. Okay.
Then they opened up their little museum to show me what they had.
Это кувшин. Детский отдыхает. Это радиолиста ловит. Это архив.
Nobody spoke English except one 11-year-old girl who was our translator.
Here's a play.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
What is your name?
So my name is Alex. I'm 32. Ah, in the book.
Now, I was in luck because that very afternoon there was a performance of the local theatre group and they very enthusiastically invited me along to see it. I smelt terrible and was covered in dust from my hike, but I said yes. We took a selfie and I said I would be back at 5 o'clock for the show. So I walked into town. I went to the Bazaar where a man gave me watermelon. I don't usually love watermelon. I've always found it to be a bit overrated as a fruit. But this stuff was out of this world.
Хорошо.
There were also some women making lavash in an oven. Then it was time to go back to the theatre. There was a good turnout, mostly mothers and children because it was the summer holidays. I have to be honest, I wasn't expecting much. And I can't pretend to know everything that was going on, but it did seem to be some sort of story about a king. Or possibly a prince. And of course there was the beautiful princess. There was also a slightly weird sex scene. But, and I mean this in the least patronizing way possible, I was really impressed. I thought it was done seriously, and the way the whole production was put together was actually quite slick. If this is community theatre in the south of Tajikistan, call me a fan. At the end, there were some words of thanks. Then it was all over. Outside, some families asked me to take their photo, and then everyone went home happy. I found Sarband to be a charming little town. Next to the cultural center is a little amusement park. In Sarband, kids are free to roam and play, boys play football, girls walk and talk in groups. It seems really quite safe and peaceful. And it's worth bearing in mind that all of this niceness can exist even in the face of some of the undoubtedly bleak realities of the country as a whole. For one thing, Tajikistan is one of the few countries that has seen a decline in its standard of living since the fall of the Soviet Union. The Tajik government basically can't offer an economy that provides reliable employment to its citizens, and so de facto supports labor migration. Around 1 million Tajiks work abroad, mostly in Russia. I've actually seen estimates up to 2 million. If they are there illegally, which a lot of them are, they have to live in the shadows and often face discrimination. Remittances, or money being sent back, make up around a half of the total gross domestic product of Tajikistan. That's right. As much as half of the entire economy of this country is Tajiks living abroad and sending money back. According to the World Bank, Tajikistan is more dependent on remittances than any other country in the world. Some estimate that half of Tajikistan's working age males are working overseas. Incidentally, that is also a huge lever that Russia can pull to have leverage over Tajikistan. Although the Tajiks sending money back from Russia is a lifeline for the national economy, the idea of hundreds of thousands of unemployed men flooding back to a situation in which there are no jobs or opportunities for economic advancement would scare any government, and so Tajikistan has to keep on good terms with Russia. Also, drug trafficking is rife, with about 1/3 of Afghanistan's opium crop passing through Tajikistan. This is connected to the building boom in Dushanbe as a way of laundering money. Also, the status of women has declined since 1991. The share of women in higher education has plummeted since the end of the Soviet Union. Arranged marriages of underage girls have risen sharply, and by 2011 it was estimated that 1 in 10 Tajik men had multiple wives. Returning to corruption, Tajikistan is 149th out of 180 countries in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. Tajiks have to pay to pass exams, get a hospital bed, or, for example, pay for a negative COVID test, an option that I was offered while I was there. To get a job as a traffic policeman, you have to pay a bribe to someone higher up so that you can then stand on the side of the road and receive bribes from other people. In a secret cable from 2010 that was released by WikiLeaks, the US Embassy in Dushanbe described how, from the president down to the policeman on the street, government is characterized by cronyism and corruption. It's a country where you can see expensive cars all over the capital, but girls sweep the streets at night.
Now let's talk about religion. Rahmon himself stresses his Muslim background and has done the Hajj to Mecca 4 times.
You can see him here, actually in Mecca, with just a savage nip slip.
However, at the same time, the government is paranoid about Islamism. Some have called their approach militant secularism. The campaign against Islamism has continued since the Civil War, and since 2016, religious-based parties have been outlawed. There are rules on appropriate dress in public and plausible reports of civilians being forced to shave their beards. In 2015, one official reported forcibly removing the beards of 13,000 men. There are also tight restrictions on who can travel to Mecca on the Hajj, such as only people over 40. The hijab is effectively banned, and people under 18 are not allowed to go to mosque, many of which have been closed. Arabic-sounding names are also banned, as is studying at religious schools outside the country. In Tajikistan, imams have to be registered, and religious material is tightly controlled. Any imam who studied abroad is not allowed to serve in official mosques, which are the only ones permitted, and surveillance has been set up in the mosques in all urban centres. Even broadcasting the call to prayer through loudspeakers is not allowed. Yet, from the government's perspective, their anxieties are not without reason. Something like 2,000 Tajik citizens have joined Islamic State, many of whom were radicalized as migrant workers in Russia. A 2017 report put Tajikistan as having contributed the highest number of suicide bombers of any foreign country in Iraq and Syria the previous year. In fact, the commander of Tajikistan's most elite special forces, called Oman, Gulmurod Halimov, actually defected to ISIS and may have become their supreme military commander. In a YouTube video, he said he would return to Tajikistan to establish Sharia law.
Слушайте, собаки, президент, министры, вы не знаете, сколько ребят, сколько братьев здесь от Хорасана ждут. Рвутся в Таджикистан, чтобы идти туда и восстановить шариат.
The message is in Russian. Kalimov is clearly addressing all Muslims in the former Soviet Union, both in Russia and in Central Asia.
Then, in 2018, in Danghara, the president's hometown, there was an attack on foreign cyclists that killed 4 people.
The attackers claimed allegiance to Islamic State.
Let's return to the issue of neighbors. Relations with neighbors, especially Uzbekistan, have until recently been bad. We have already mentioned the tensions that Tajikistan had with Uzbekistan over their inability to deal with the terrorist group, the IMU. But one of the biggest problems in Central Asian politics is about water. In essence, countries with mountains control the rivers that flow out of them, which means the water. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan both have mountains. Uzbekistan doesn't have many mountains, but does have a lot of people and needs a lot of water. In fact, the conflict last year between Kyrgyz and Tajiks in the Ferghana Valley that I mentioned in an earlier video was also about water. So, any effort by Tajikistan to use any more of the water that comes from its mountains than they currently do, for example, by building a dam, creates big problems. Specifically, Tajikistan has been wanting to build the 335-meter Rogan Dam for ages. If they could construct it, it would end their chronic power shortages. In Central Asia, this is the sort of thing that wars are fought over. Former President of Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov, said exactly that in 2012. If you needed reminding, Uzbekistan is much, much bigger than Tajikistan, both in terms of population and in terms of wealth. For one thing, Uzbekistan has reliable access to oil and gas, which Tajikistan doesn't. Under Karimov, Uzbekistan would regularly change gas prices or cut deliveries during the coldest months, which is obviously a total dick move. He also laid landmines along the border. It has been a fraught situation. However, since 2016, when Islam Karimov died and the new president Mirziyoyev came to power, relations have improved a lot. And lastly, on the topic of neighbors, to the south, the Taliban are back in control of Afghanistan. All of Afghanistan's neighbors have had to come to terms with this, and all have said that they are at least willing to talk to the Taliban, except Tajikistan. They have come out strongly against the Taliban. Rahmon has always supported the ethnic Tajik groups fighting the Taliban inside Afghanistan. And remember that ethnic Tajiks make up roughly 25% of Afghanistan's population. So, how would Tajikistan's military fare against the Taliban? Who knows? The Tajik military has been getting support from Russia for decades, but also recently China and the US, NATO, and the European Union, who have paid for border infrastructure. Yet Tajikistan still shares a 1,400-kilometer border, and Tajikistan's army is a poorly equipped conscript army that is riven by corruption. In fact, during recruitment season, there's a whole genre of online video of young men being kidnapped and bundled into cars, from where they are taken away to training.
В стране называют ёмким словом «облава», нарушают множество статей Уголовного кодекса: превышение должностных полномочий, нарушение неприкосновенности жилища, уничтожение имущества и других.
Their phones are taken from them, and often their family has no idea where they are. The raids are illegal, but the enlistment officers have quotas to fulfill. Young men avoid even returning home because of the risk of being conscripted. Of course, the wealthy and well-connected can always bribe their way out of it. But for most Tajik soldiers, abuse and terrible conditions are widespread, so it's unclear how the army would do if they were ever really tested. So they rely on Russia a lot. That brings us to China. As far as we can tell, about half of Tajikistan's foreign debt is to China. Recently, Tajikistan actually handed over mining rights to China in a pretty dodgy deal that lots of Tajiks don't like. You can see a lot here that is part of the One Belt, One Road project. At the same time, Russia still considers Central Asia to be its backyard, especially militarily. However, in the last 5 years, Chinese army units have begun to appear in Tajikistan, especially in the Pamirs, which both countries deny, and China has staged war games with the Tajik army and trained some of its soldiers. In fact, it seems there is a secret Chinese base up in the Pamirs. The base has become an open secret, although the Tajik government denies its existence. So, that's a brief summary of Tajikistan today. And I hope, with the first 2 videos in this series, it has given you a snapshot of where the country stands. I finished my time in Tajikistan by leaving Dushanbe and heading north to Khujand.
I got up early one morning and left the Yarganov Valley, where I had been staying. It was a wonderful sunny summer's day in Central Asia. Khujand is in the Ferghana Valley, the richest and most fertile part of Tajikistan. The city itself was founded by Alexander the Great 2,500 years ago. Until the fall of the Soviet Union, it was better connected to Tashkent than to Dushanbe. It used to be called Leninabad, and they still have one of the world's biggest Lenin statues. I went to the Bazaar, as I always do, which is an amazing place to watch such a range of regular human interaction. Drunks lay in the park. A man sold bananas from some far-off place. Rahmon looked down benevolently. I found my way out to a palace that was practicing for a fashion show that the president was going to attend. On the war memorial, kids play and take pictures. In the evening, the birds in the city centre's parks are thunderous. And outside the bazaar, they're packing up. So, what do I think of Tajikistan? Having spent a little bit over a month in the country, I can't pretend to be an expert, but I like it a lot. People felt very friendly and open and approachable, certainly more so than in neighbouring Uzbekistan, where I have spent a lot more time. Other travellers I talked to had the same impression. If you are visiting, there's certainly a lot to do, whether that is hiking or history, and everywhere I went felt safe, probably safer than any big city I've been to in wealthy Western countries, including New Zealand. The big caveat to that is that I was travelling as a solo male, and I suspect that might be very different if you're travelling as a solo female. And it is impossible to escape the fact that there are two worlds in Tajikistan, just like most developing countries. While I was in Dushanbe, I went to a concert put on by the French embassy. People were dancing, boys and girls together, and those teenagers probably spoke Russian as well as English and were tapped into global youth culture. But you don't have to go far out of the city to see the other part of Tajikistan, the one in which people are struggling to survive on minimum wages and their lives are intruded upon by daily corruption. Up here in the hills above Dushanbe, looking down on the city, in the evening women and children collect the dung from their cows, presumably to use for fuel. Like I said, two worlds.